The sand beneath my boots was wrong, too fine, too white, and the air tasted like copper and fear. I shouldn't have been standing there, 300 yards from ground zero, watching technicians in khaki uniforms scramble around a steel tower that held the end of the world. But the chrono device on my left wrist had malfunctioned during transit, dumping me 48 hours before the scheduled arrival time. And now I was caught in the machinery of history's most terrible dawn. My name is Nicola Brown. I'm 32 years old and I've walked through more centuries than most people can name. I've stood on the beaches of Normandy as the invasion fleet gathered in the pre-dawn mist. I've watched Lincoln deliver the Gettysburg Address to a crowd that didn't yet understand they were witnessing immortality. I've been to ancient Rome, medieval Japan, revolutionary Paris. But nothing in my training, nothing in the hundreds of jumps I'd made through the timeline had prepared me for this moment. The moment when a security guard with a Thompson submachine gun pressed the barrel against my spine and asked me who the hell I was and why I was standing in the middle of the most classified location on Earth. "Don't move," he said, his voice tight with the kind of fear that makes men's fingers twitch on triggers. "Hands where I can see them." Slowly, I raised my hands, feeling the weight of the chrono device hidden beneath my brown coat. The desert sun hammered down on my shoulders, and I could smell the oil and gunpowder on the guard's uniform. Behind us, the steel tower rose 100 feet into the cloudless New Mexico sky, and at its top, nestled in its cradle of cables and instruments, sat the gadget. That's what they called it, the gadget. As if giving it a mundane name could somehow diminish what it was, what it would become. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. The chronofiber vest beneath my shirt felt suddenly heavy, constricting. I'd been in dangerous situations before, shot at in trenches, chased through medieval castles, nearly burned at stakes. But there was something uniquely terrifying about standing in the New Mexico desert with a nervous soldier's gun pressed against my back and the first atomic bomb gleaming in the sunlight behind us. "I'm Dr. James Wilson," I said, using the cover identity that headquarters had implanted into the 1945 records 3 weeks before I jumped. "Theoretical physics. I was supposed to report to Dr. Oppenheimer this morning, but I got turned around coming from Santa Fe. These dirt roads all look the same." The guard didn't lower his weapon. I could feel the barrel trembling slightly against my spine, and I wondered if he was more scared than I was. "Nobody told me about any Dr. Wilson." "Nobody tells you anything," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost bored. It was a trick I'd learned over years of time travel. Act like you belong, and people will usually believe you. That's the point of security. But if you march me off this test site with a gun in my back, you're going to have to explain to General Groves why you detained one of his physicists. And from what I've heard, the general doesn't appreciate explanations. I could feel him hesitate. The mention of Groves was calculated. Leslie Groves was the military commander of the Manhattan Project, a man whose temper was as legendary as his organizational genius. He'd bulldozed through bureaucracy, congressional oversight, and scientific disagreement to build this project from nothing. A man who could relocate entire towns, commandeer industrial capacity, and keep hundreds of thousands of people working on a secret they didn't understand. The guard shifted his weight and I heard the scrape of boots on sand. "Turn around," he said. Slowly, I turned and for the first time I saw his face. He was young, maybe 23, with the kind of clean-cut features that belonged in a recruitment poster. Sandy haircut, military short, blue eyes that kept darting between me and the tower behind us. But his eyes were older than his years, haunted by whatever he'd been told about what was happening in this desert. What they were building, what they were about to unleash. "Let me see your identification," he said. I reached slowly into my coat pocket, making sure to move with deliberate care. The last thing I needed was for this kid to panic and shoot me. My fingers found the papers that the Chrononaut techs had forged with painstaking accuracy. Driver's license issued by the state of California. Security clearance signed by General Groves himself. A letter of introduction from Robert Oppenheimer on University of California letterhead, complete with coffee stains and creases that made it look like it had been carried in someone's pocket for weeks. The guard studied them, his jaw working as he read. I could see him comparing the photo on the license to my face, checking the signatures, looking for any sign that the documents were fake. But the Chrononaut forgers were the best in the business. They had to be. One wrong serial number, one anachronistic font, and you could find yourself in an interrogation room explaining how you knew things you couldn't possibly know. "Why didn't you come through the main checkpoint?" he asked, still suspicious. "I did," I lied smoothly. "But I wanted to see the test site, wanted to understand what we're dealing with before I met with the team. I'm a theoretical physicist, Corporal. I spend most of my time working with equations on chalkboards. But this," I gestured toward the tower, "this is real. This is what all those equations add up to. I needed to see it with my own eyes." Something in my voice must have convinced him, or maybe he just didn't want to risk the wrath of General Groves. He handed back my papers and finally lowered his weapon, though he didn't holster it. "You need an escort. Nobody walks around out here alone. Too many things you're not cleared to see." "Then escort me," I said. "Take me to Dr. Oppenheimer." The guard studied me for a long moment, and I could see him making calculations, weighing risks. His name tape read, Ellis. Corporal Ellis, a kid from somewhere in the Midwest probably, who'd signed up to fight Nazis and found himself guarding the most dangerous secret in human history. Finally he nodded. "Stay close. Don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you it's okay. And for God's sake, don't mention anything you've seen out here. Half the people on this base don't know what we're building, and it needs to stay that way." We walked through the desert, past rows of temporary buildings that had been thrown up in the middle of nowhere. The architecture was purely functional. Flat roofs, no ornamentation, everything painted in shades of tan and olive drab to blend with the landscape. As if you could hide something like this from the universe itself. As if the gods weren't watching. I could see scientists moving between buildings, their shirt sleeves rolled up against the heat, carrying clipboards and slide rules. Most of them looked exhausted. There were dark circles under their eyes, a tension in their movements that spoke of too much coffee and not enough sleep. They were racing against a clock only they could hear, pushing themselves toward a finish line that terrified them even as they sprinted toward it. As we walked, Corporal Ellis loosened up enough to talk. He told me he'd been stationed at Los Alamos for 8 months, that he'd enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, full of patriotic fury and the certainty that he'd be fighting on the front lines in Europe or the Pacific. Instead, he'd found himself guarding scientists in the New Mexico desert, watching men in suits and lab coats work on something he couldn't understand and wasn't allowed to ask about. "They tell us it's important," he said as we passed a group of technicians loading equipment onto a truck. "They say what we're doing here will end the war, but nobody explains how. Nobody tells us what's in that tower, or why we need guards with machine guns posted every 50 yards, or why there are radiation badges on everyone's uniforms." He touched the small film badge pinned to his chest. "Do you know what these are for, Dr. Wilson?" I looked at the radiation dosimeter badge, a simple device that would darken if exposed to too much radiation. Most of the guards probably thought they were just another piece of military bureaucracy. They had no idea that those badges were the only thing standing between them and a slow death from radiation poisoning. "They measure exposure to certain kinds of particles," I said carefully. "If the badge turns dark, it means you've been exposed to something dangerous. Something that could make you sick." His face went pale. "Is that what we're building? Some kind of poison weapon?" I wanted to tell him that yes, in a way, that's exactly what they were building. That the gadget would poison the earth where it detonated, that the fallout would drift for miles, that the radiation would seep into bones and blood and DNA, causing cancers and mutations and birth defects for generations. That we were about to unleash something that would poison not just the land but the future itself. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded toward a long, low building ahead of us. "Is that where Dr. Oppenheimer's office is?" Corporal Ellis nodded, clearly relieved to change the subject. "Yeah, that's the main administrative building. Most of the senior scientists work out of there." He paused. "Fair warning, Dr. Wilson. Dr. Oppenheimer isn't like the other scientists. He's brilliant, everyone says so, but he's also..." He struggled for the right word. "Intense. He doesn't sleep much, doesn't eat much, just works all the time, smoking those cigarettes, staring at equations like they're going to reveal the secrets of the universe. Some of the guys think he's going to work himself to death before the test even happens. We reached the building, and Corporal Ellis led me through doors that were guarded by 2 more soldiers with Thompson submachine guns. Inside, the air was cooler, almost cold. Fans mounted on the ceiling pushed air through the corridors, rustling the papers that seemed to cover every available surface. Blueprints, calculations, memorandums. The accumulated paperwork of the most ambitious scientific project in human history. We walked down a corridor lined with offices. Through open doors, I could see scientists hunched over desks, working with slide rules and mechanical calculators, filling chalkboards with equations. I recognized some of the mathematics from my training. Neutron cross-sections for plutonium-239, critical mass calculations for spherical assemblies, hydrodynamic equations for the implosion wave, the language of apocalypse, written in Greek letters and differential equations. At one door, I caught a glimpse of a young man with wild curly hair, frantically scribbling on a chalkboard while another scientist argued with him in rapid-fire technical jargon. I recognized him from the historical records. Richard Feynman, one of the brightest minds on the project, a man who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum electrodynamics. Right now, he was just another exhausted physicist, racing toward a deadline that would change the world. At the end of the corridor, Corporal Ellis knocked on a door. "Come in," said a voice from inside. It was soft, cultured, with a hint of his New York upbringing. We entered, and I saw him for the first time. J. Robert Oppenheimer sat behind a desk piled with papers and technical reports, a cigarette burning forgotten in an ashtray at his elbow. He was thin, almost gaunt, with hollow cheeks and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He wore a rumpled suit that hung loose on his frame, and his trademark pork pie hat hung on a hook behind the door. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past year. The photographs I'd seen of him before the war showed a confident, almost arrogant young professor. The man sitting before me looked like he was carrying the weight of worlds on his shoulders. And maybe he was. "Dr. Wilson," he said, rising from his chair. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "We've been expecting you, though I was told you wouldn't arrive until tomorrow." "I caught an earlier train," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but his fingers were cold despite the desert heat outside. I could feel the slight tremor in them, the result of too much coffee and too little sleep. Oppenheimer dismissed Corporal Ellis with a nod, and we were alone. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I sat down, acutely aware of the chrono device hidden beneath my coat. If he noticed the slight bulk under my left sleeve, he didn't comment on it. But those blue eyes studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. It was like being examined under a microscope. "I understand you're here to consult on the theoretical aspects of the implosion design," he said, lighting a fresh cigarette from the butt of the old one. The ashtray on his desk was overflowing. Edward Teller suggested we could use another set of eyes on the calculations. Make sure we haven't missed anything. At this late stage, with the test less than 48 hours away, we can't afford any surprises. This was the cover story headquarters had created for me. I was supposed to be a minor consultant, brought in at the last minute to double-check the mathematics that would determine whether the gadget actually worked. It was a role that would give me access to the test while keeping me on the periphery of the project. Invisible, but present. A ghost in the machine. "That's right," I said. I reviewed some of the preliminary data on the train ride down. The implosion lens design is elegant, very elegant. Using shaped charges to create a spherical compression wave, it's brilliant. But there are still variables we don't fully understand. The behavior of plutonium under extreme pressure, the timing of the detonators. Any one of a dozen factors could cause the whole thing to fizzle. Oppenheimer smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a man who'd thought about every possible failure mode, who'd lain awake at night imagining all the ways this could go wrong. There are always variables we don't fully understand. That's why we're testing it. That's why we're about to detonate a device that might ignite the atmosphere and extinguish all life on Earth. The way he said it, so casually, without drama or emphasis, made my blood run cold. I'd read the historical records, of course. I knew that some of the Manhattan Project scientists had briefly worried about the possibility of an atmospheric chain reaction. The idea that the temperatures and pressures created by the atomic explosion might cause nitrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere to fuse, releasing enough energy to trigger a runaway reaction that would burn away the entire atmosphere in a wave of fire. The calculations had shown it was impossible. The energies involved weren't sufficient. The reaction rates were too slow. But there had been that moment of doubt, that terrifying instant when the scientists realized that they were doing something that had never been done before, that they were reaching into territory where the physics textbooks offered no guidance. "You don't really believe that will happen," I said. Oppenheimer took a long drag on his cigarette and stared at me with those penetrating blue eyes. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that we don't know. Not with absolute certainty. We've done the calculations. We've run the numbers 1,000 times, and every calculation says it's impossible. But there's always a margin of error, always a chance that we've missed something, that our understanding of the physics is incomplete." He paused. "And yet we're going to press the button anyway. We're going to light the fuse and hope that we haven't miscalculated. Because if we don't, if we hesitate, then the Germans might build it first. Or the Japanese. And then God help us all." "The Germans have already surrendered," I said carefully, watching his reaction. "The war in Europe ended 2 months ago. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen." "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, it is. Which raises an interesting question, doesn't it, Dr. Wilson? Why are we still doing this? Why are we about to test a weapon that we no longer need to defeat Hitler? What's the point of building the most destructive device in human history if the enemy we built it to fight has already been destroyed?" It was a trap, of course, a test to see how I would respond. Oppenheimer was famously brilliant, famously paranoid, and famously prone to philosophical debates about the morality of the work he was doing. He was probing me, trying to understand who I really was, whether I could be trusted. "The Japanese," I said. "The war in the Pacific continues, and every day it goes on, more people die. American soldiers storming fortified islands, Japanese soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrender, civilians caught in the crossfire. If this weapon can end the war quickly, if it can save lives by shortening the conflict, then perhaps it's justified." "Perhaps," Oppenheimer echoed, and the word hung in the air between us like smoke. "That's the word, isn't it? Perhaps. Maybe. Possibly. We're about to unleash something that changes human history forever, and all we have is perhaps." He stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary and immediately reached for another. His hands were trembling. "Tell me, Dr. Wilson, do you sleep well at night?" "No," I said honestly. "I don't." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the human being beneath the scientific genius. "Neither do I. I lie awake and think about what we're creating. I think about the cities that will burn, the people who will die, the children who will be born with deformities because of the radiation. I think about the arms race that will follow, the terror that will define the rest of this century and beyond." He lit the fresh cigarette with shaking hands. "And I think about the fact that I'm the one leading this project, that my name will forever be associated with this terrible dawn, that historians will remember me as the father of the atomic bomb, as the man who gave humanity the power to destroy itself." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sand in shades of gold and orange. "Do you know what I told my brother Frank? I told him that when this is over I'll have blood on my hands, that I'll be remembered as a destroyer. And he asked me if I thought it was worth it, if the end justified the means." "What did you tell him?" I asked quietly. Oppenheimer turned to look at me, and the anguish in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "I told him that I didn't know. And that's the hell of it, Dr. Wilson. I simply don't know. We've created something that might save hundreds of thousands of lives by ending the war quickly. Or we might have created the instrument of humanity's extinction, and we won't know which until it's too late to turn back." He returned to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the conversation was physically exhausting him. "I've been thinking about a passage from the Bhagavad Gita. It's a Hindu scripture I studied years ago at Berkeley. There's a moment when the god Vishnu reveals his true form to the warrior Prince Arjuna, and Vishnu says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That line keeps running through my head. I can't escape it, because that's what we're doing, isn't it? We're becoming death. We're taking on the power of gods, or the power of demons, I said quietly. Oppenheimer looked at me sharply. Is there a difference? When you have the power to destroy cities, to kill millions, to reshape the course of human history, does it matter whether you call yourself a god or a demon? The result is the same. The blood is still on your hands. Before I could respond, there was another knock at the door and a young man in an army uniform stuck his head in. "Dr. Oppenheimer? General Groves wants to see you. Something about the weather forecast for the test." Oppenheimer sighed and stood up, reaching for his pork pie hat. "The test is scheduled for early Monday morning, less than 48 hours from now. General Groves is worried about the wind patterns. If we detonate in the wrong conditions, the fallout could drift over populated areas." He gave me a bitter smile. "As if we can control where the poison goes once we've let it out of the bottle." He put on his hat and turned to me. "You should get settled in. We have quarters set up for visiting personnel in one of the dormitories. It's not luxurious, but it's better than sleeping on the ground. Tomorrow, I want you to review the final calculations with George Kistiakowski's implosion team, and on Monday morning you'll witness history, for better or worse." After he left, I sat alone in his office for a few minutes, staring at the piles of papers on his desk, reports on plutonium metallurgy, calculations of blast radii and radiation dispersal, letters from military officials demanding status updates. The accumulated weight of the Manhattan Project, all funneled through one man's desk, all resting on one man's shoulders. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the test site in the distance. I could just barely see the steel tower, a thin line against the horizon. In 48 hours, that tower would be vaporized. The sand beneath it would be fused into radioactive glass, and the world would never be the same. I thought about my mission briefing back at headquarters before I jumped. The senior chrononauts had been explicit. I wasn't supposed to interfere with the Trinity test. It was a fixed point in history, one of those events that couldn't be changed without risking catastrophic paradoxes. My job was simply to observe, to witness the moment that humanity entered the atomic age, and to report back on the emotional and psychological state of the people who had made it happen. But sitting in Oppenheimer's office, seeing the anguish in his eyes, hearing the doubt in his voice, I wondered if observation was enough. If bearing witness to tragedy without trying to prevent it made me complicit in what was about to happen. I left the administrative building and found my way to the dormitory where visiting personnel were housed. It was a simple wooden structure divided into small rooms, barely large enough for a bed and a desk. The walls were thin enough that I could hear conversations in the adjacent rooms, scientists arguing about technical details or playing cards to pass the time. I lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Los Alamos at night. Trucks rumbling past, generators humming, distant voices calling out. The machinery of the Manhattan Project grinding forward toward its inexorable conclusion. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking on my door. I sat up, disoriented, and saw that the light coming through the small window had changed. It was early morning, the sky just beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. "Dr. Wilson?" a voice called from outside. "Dr. Oppenheimer asked me to fetch you. The implosion team is meeting in an hour to go over the final checklist." I got up, splashed some water on my face from the basin in the corner, and followed the young physicist. He introduced himself as Philip Morrison to one of the technical buildings. Inside, a group of about 15 scientists were gathered around a large table covered with blueprints and technical diagrams. George Kistiakowski stood at the head of the table, a stocky man with intense dark eyes and an Eastern European accent that spoke of his Ukrainian birth. He was one of the world's leading experts on explosives, recruited by Oppenheimer specifically to solve the implosion problem. And he had solved it, designing a system of shaped charges so precise that they could compress a plutonium sphere to critical density in less than a microsecond. "Gentlemen," he said, rapping his knuckles on the table to get everyone's attention, "we have less than 48 hours until the test. I want to go through every single element of the firing sequence one more time. Dr. Wilson here is our last set of fresh eyes on the calculations, so if any of you have concerns or questions, now is the time to raise them. For the next 6 hours, we worked through every detail of the implosion system, the 32 explosive lenses that would surround the plutonium core, the electrical firing system that had to detonate all 32 charges within a microsecond of each other, the neutron initiator at the center of the core that would provide the initial burst of neutrons to start the chain reaction, the layers of tamper material that would reflect neutrons back into the core and increase the efficiency of the explosion. It was brilliant work, terrifying in its implications, but brilliant. Every element had been calculated, tested, refined. They'd built test models, detonated conventional explosives, taken high-speed photographs of the implosion waves. They'd solved problems that no one had even known existed a few years ago. But there was still uncertainty. Still variables that couldn't be fully controlled. The exact behavior of plutonium under extreme compression. The possibility of pre-detonation if even a single neutron triggered the chain reaction a microsecond too early. The potential for asymmetries in the implosion wave that could cause the core to squirt out the side rather than compress uniformly. What if it doesn't work? Asked a young physicist named Theodore. What if we press the button and nothing happens? Kistiakowsky laughed, but there was tension in it. Then I lose a month's salary to Oppenheimer. I bet him the gadget would yield at least 300 tons of TNT equivalent. If it fizzles, he wins the bet. He paused. But I don't think it's going to fizzle. I think it's going to work exactly as designed. And that's what scares me. The room fell silent. No one wanted to acknowledge what Kistiakowsky had just said, that success was more terrifying than failure, that the world might be better off if the gadget didn't work. We're not here to have second thoughts, said another physicist, a man I recognized as Kenneth Bainbridge, the director of the Trinity test. We're here to make sure this thing works. We've come too far, invested too much to back out now. So let's focus on doing our jobs and leave the moral philosophy to someone else. But the moral philosophy couldn't be set aside. It hung over everything we did, coloring every calculation, every decision. We were building a weapon that could kill 100,000 people in an instant. How could we not think about the morality of that? I spent the rest of Saturday working with the implosion team, double-checking calculations, reviewing test data, helping to solve last-minute technical problems. The work was absorbing enough that I could almost forget what it was for, almost pretend that we were just solving an interesting physics problem rather than building the most destructive device in human history. But then I'd step outside for a break, and I'd see the tower in the distance with the gadget at its top, and reality would crash back over me. That evening, I found myself in the mess hall, eating a dinner I couldn't taste. The mess hall was crowded with scientists and military personnel, all of them talking in low voices about the test. The atmosphere was strange, part excitement, part dread, part exhaustion. We were standing at the edge of a precipice and everyone knew it. I saw Oppenheimer come in, moving through the crowd like a ghost. People tried to talk to him, to ask him questions, but he deflected them all with a few words and a wan smile. He looked even more haggard than he had the day before. He took a cup of coffee but didn't touch the food. I caught his eye across the room, and he nodded toward the door. I followed him outside into the warm desert evening. How did it go with Kistiakowsky's team? He asked, lighting yet another cigarette. The implosion system is as good as it can be, I said. The mathematics is sound. The engineering is brilliant. If anything can make this work, it's what you've built here. That's what I'm afraid of, he said quietly. Sometimes I lie awake at night hoping that we've made a mistake, that some crucial calculation is wrong, that the whole thing will fizzle when we press the button. He took a long drag on his cigarette. But I don't think we've made a mistake. I think it's going to work. And then we'll have to live with what we've done. We walked in silence for a while, moving away from the buildings toward the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. It was beautiful, in the way that deserts are beautiful, vast and empty and indifferent to human concerns. Tell me something, Dr. Wilson, Oppenheimer said finally. If you could go back in time knowing what you know now, would you still work on this project? Would you still help build the bomb? The irony of the question nearly made me laugh. Here I was, a literal time traveler, being asked about the ethics of changing history. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'd like to think I'd have the courage to refuse, to walk away from the project and let someone else carry the burden. But I don't know if I could actually do it. The pressure to contribute, to use your knowledge to help win the war, to prove that you're on the right side, it's overwhelming." "Yes," Oppenheimer said. "Yes, it is. And that's how they get you. They appeal to your patriotism, your sense of duty, your intellectual vanity. They tell you that you're needed, that you're special, that only you can solve this problem. And before you know it, you're in too deep to back out. You've committed yourself to something you can't undo." He stopped walking and turned to face me. "Do you know why I really accepted the leadership of this project? It wasn't patriotism, though that was part of it. It wasn't scientific curiosity, though that was part of it too. It was arrogance, pure arrogance. I believed that I was the only one who could do it, that I was smart enough, disciplined enough, visionary enough to make this work. And I was right. I did make it work, and now I have to live with the consequences of my arrogance." "You're being too hard on yourself," I said. "Am I?" He laughed bitterly. "In less than 48 hours, we're going to detonate the most powerful weapon ever created by human beings. And it's going to work because of decisions I made, problems I solved, people I recruited. If I hadn't taken this job, maybe someone else would have done it. Maybe they would have succeeded. But maybe they would have failed. Maybe they would have taken longer, given the wartime to end before the bomb was ready. Maybe hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians would have lived instead of dying in atomic fire." He dropped his cigarette and ground it out under his heel. "But I didn't fail. I succeeded brilliantly, and people are going to die because of that success. So tell me, Dr. Wilson, how am I being too hard on myself?" I didn't have an answer for him, because he was right. In 3 weeks, Little Boy would destroy Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Fat Man would destroy Nagasaki. And those bombs would work because of the research done here, the problem solved here, the knowledge gained here. Oppenheimer's genius had made it all possible. We walked back to the buildings in silence. As we approached the administrative building, Oppenheimer turned to me. "Get some sleep, Dr. Wilson. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. We'll be doing final preparations for the test. And tomorrow night, we'll all be awake, waiting for dawn, waiting to see if we've created a new age or brought about the end of the world." I went back to my dormitory room, but sleep was impossible. I lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Los Alamos at night, thinking about what was coming, thinking about Oppenheimer's anguish, about the moral weight he carried, about the terrible irony of being a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the fundamental nature of reality, only to use that knowledge to build a device for destroying reality on a massive scale. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and went outside. The desert night was cool and clear, the stars so bright and numerous that they seemed to fill the entire sky. I walked away from the buildings, following a dirt road that led toward the test site. Security was tighter at night, but I knew how to move quietly, how to avoid the patrols, a skill learned from years of slipping through history unnoticed. I walked for maybe an hour until I could see the tower silhouetted against the stars. Even from miles away, it looked ominous, a thin steel structure rising from the desert floor, holding something that would change the world forever. I thought about all the other moments I'd witnessed in my travels through time, moments of triumph and tragedy, of heroism and horror. I'd seen the best and worst of humanity, watched civilizations rise and fall, witnessed the great turning points of history. But this felt different. This felt like a boundary, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Before Trinity, humanity's capacity for destruction was limited by conventional means. We could kill thousands, even tens of thousands, but it took time, resources, sustained effort. After Trinity, we would have the power to erase cities in an instant, to kill hundreds of thousands with a single bomb, to threaten the very existence of civilization. It was that realization that had driven some of the Manhattan Project scientists to despair. The knowledge that they were creating something that couldn't be unmade, that would exist forever as a possibility, a temptation, a threat. Even if every atomic weapon was destroyed, the knowledge of how to build them would remain. Humanity would forever live under the shadow of its own potential for self-destruction. I stood there in the desert darkness for a long time, watching the tower, thinking about tomorrow, about what it would mean to witness the birth of the atomic age, about whether I had any right to stand on the sidelines and watch history unfold without trying to change it. But what could I change? The research had been done. The bombs had been built. In a few hours, the test would happen, and no action I took could prevent it. The gadget was already assembled, already mounted on the tower. The countdown had already begun in a sense. All that remained was to run out the clock. I walked back to Los Alamos as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Sunday morning, less than 24 hours until the test. The base was already buzzing with activity. Scientists and technicians moving equipment, running final checks, preparing for the test. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that we were approaching the moment of truth. I spent most of Sunday in technical meetings, reviewing checklists, going over contingency plans. What to do if the weather turned bad? What to do if the firing system malfunctioned? What to do if the gadget didn't achieve critical mass? Every possible scenario had been considered, planned for, rehearsed. But no one had a plan for what to do if it worked. If it worked, we would all just have to deal with the consequences. In the late afternoon, I found myself in a small conference room with a group of scientists who'd worked on the theoretical aspects of the bomb. Edward Teller was there, the Hungarian physicist who would later become known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Hans Bethe was there, the German émigré who'd done crucial work on the energy generation in stars and had applied that knowledge to understanding nuclear explosions. Enrico Fermi was there, the Italian Nobel laureate, who'd built the first nuclear reactor under the stands of a football stadium in Chicago. They were discussing the expected yield of the gadget, trying to predict how powerful the explosion would be. Estimates ranged from a few hundred tons of TNT equivalent to as much as 20,000 tons. No one really knew. This was unprecedented territory. I still think there's a chance of atmospheric ignition, Teller said, half joking, but with an edge of real concern in his voice. Not a large chance, but not zero either. If the temperatures get high enough, if the reaction proceeds faster than we expect, there's a non-zero probability that we could trigger a chain reaction in the atmosphere. The calculations say it's impossible, Beth replied, sounding tired. They'd clearly had this argument before. The binding energies don't work out. The reaction rates are too slow. Even if we somehow achieve the temperatures necessary for nitrogen fusion, the reaction would die out almost immediately. But we don't know that, Teller insisted. We've never tested this. We've never created these conditions before. What if our understanding of the nuclear physics is incomplete? What if there's something we've missed? Then we're all about to die, Fermi said mildly. And there's nothing we can do about it. The test is happening tomorrow morning whether we like it or not. General Groves has already given the go-ahead. The weather window is favorable. The equipment is in place. All we can do now is watch and see what happens. You're taking this very calmly, I observed. Fermi shrugged. What choice do I have? We've done the calculations. We've checked them dozens of times. Either we're right or we're wrong. If we're right, we'll create a powerful explosion and advance scientific knowledge. If we're wrong, we'll all be dead before we realize our mistake. Worrying about it won't change the outcome. It was classic Fermi, utterly pragmatic, focused on the physics rather than the emotions. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed on the table. Even Fermi, with his legendary calm, was nervous about what was coming. The meeting broke up as evening approached. Scientists drifted off to their quarters or to the mess hall, trying to pass the time before the test. Some played poker, others read. A few tried to sleep, though I doubted they were successful. I found Oppenheimer in his office again, sitting in the dark, smoking. I knocked on the door frame, and he looked up. "Dr. Wilson," he said. "Come in." I was just sitting here thinking about tomorrow. I entered and sat down across from him. The office was thick with smoke, and I could barely see Oppenheimer's face in the darkness. Only the glowing tip of his cigarette marked his presence. "Are you afraid?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "Terrified," he said finally. "Not of the test itself, but of what comes after. If it works, If we demonstrate that we can build a weapon of this magnitude, then the arms race begins. The Soviets will want their own bombs, the British, the French. Eventually, dozens of countries will have nuclear weapons, and all it takes is one mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of madness, and millions of people die. And if it doesn't work? I asked. Then we try again, he said simply. We fix whatever went wrong and test it again, because the knowledge exists now. The physics is understood. Someone, somewhere, will eventually build a working atomic bomb. Better that it's us, better that it's now than waiting for someone else to do it. He lit another cigarette from the butt of the last one. I keep thinking about the Manhattan Project as a whole. We've spent over $2 billion. We've employed hundreds of thousands of people. We've built entire cities in the middle of nowhere, all to build 3 bombs, the test device, and 2 that will actually be used in war. That's almost $1 billion per bomb. It's the most expensive scientific project in human history. And it's going to work, I said. Yes, he agreed. It's going to work. And then we'll have to figure out how to live in the world we've created. We sat in silence for a while, 2 men in a dark office waiting for dawn, waiting for the moment that would define the rest of the century. I should go, I said finally. We need to be at the observation bunkers before dawn. Oppenheimer nodded. Yes. The test is scheduled for 5:30 a.m., assuming the weather holds. We'll all gather at S-10,000, the main control bunker. That's where the countdown will be conducted, where the final decision to fire will be made. He paused. See you there, Dr. Wilson. At the dawn of a new age. The next few hours passed in a blur. Scientists and military personnel moved through Los Alamos like sleepwalkers, gathering equipment, double-checking preparations, trying to keep their minds occupied. No one could sleep. We were all too keyed up, too aware that we were standing on the edge of history. Around 3 a.m., vehicles began assembling to transport observers to the observation bunkers scattered across the desert. I was assigned to a jeep that would take me to S-10,000, the main control point. But as I stood in the darkness waiting for the jeep to depart, I made a decision. I wasn't going to watch the test from a bunker 10,000 yards away. I wasn't going to observe history through thick glass from a reinforced concrete shelter. I wanted to be closer. I wanted to see it, feel it, experience it. I wanted to understand on a visceral level what we had created. So when no one was looking, I slipped away from the convoy. I moved through the darkness using the skills I'd honed over years of time travel, avoiding the security patrols, making my way toward ground zero. It took me nearly 2 hours to get close enough. I stopped about 2 miles from the tower, far enough away that I wouldn't be vaporized instantly if the test went wrong, close enough that I could see every detail of what was about to happen. I found an outcropping of rock and crouched behind it, watching the horizon. The desert was still dark, but the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming, and with it, a new age for humanity. I checked the chrono device on my wrist. 4:47 a.m., July 16th, 1945. 43 minutes until the test. The loudspeakers crackled to life, and I heard the countdown begin. Minus 60 minutes and counting. My heart was pounding. I pressed myself against the rock, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. If the calculations were wrong, if the blast was larger than predicted, I could die here, vaporized by atomic fire. A footnote in history, if anyone even noticed. But I couldn't leave. I had to see this. I had to witness it. The sky continued to lighten. I could see the tower now, a thin line against the pale dawn sky. At its top, barely visible, was the gadget, a sphere of explosives and plutonium, 5 feet in diameter, containing the power of 20,000 tons of TNT, minus 30 minutes and counting. I thought about Oppenheimer, sitting in the control bunker watching the countdown clock. I thought about all the scientists who had worked on this project, who had poured their genius and their anguish into making this moment possible. I thought about the soldiers who would fight in the Pacific, who might be saved by this weapon or doomed by it. And I thought about the Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, going about their lives, unaware that in 3 weeks, some of them would see a light brighter than the sun, would feel heat intense enough to melt stone, would be burned away in an instant, their shadows permanently etched into walls and pavement. Minus 20 minutes and counting. The wind had died. The desert was utterly still. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. The whole world was holding its breath. Minus 15 minutes and counting. I could see guards patrolling near the tower, making final checks. They would retreat to safety soon, leaving the gadget alone on its tower, waiting for the signal that would unleash its power. Minus 10 minutes and counting. The guards were leaving now, climbing into jeeps and driving away from ground zero. The tower stood alone, a steel skeleton holding the future in its arms. Minus 5 minutes and counting. I pressed myself against the rock, my entire body tense. This was it. The moment that would change everything. Minus 3 minutes and counting. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, to pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I had to see it. Minus 2 minutes and counting. The sky was light now. Dawn had arrived. The stars had faded. It was going to be a beautiful day. Minus 1 minute and counting. I thought about Oppenheimer's words. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Minus 30 seconds. The desert held its breath. Minus 20 seconds. Time seemed to slow. Each second stretched out, became an eternity. Minus 15 seconds. I closed my eyes, then opened them again. I had to watch. I had to see. Minus 10 seconds. My hands were over my ears, but I could still hear the countdown. Minus 5 seconds. Everything was still. 4. The world paused. 3. I held my breath. 2. This was it. 1. And then, for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The world remained normal, unchanged, still balanced on the edge between the old age and the new. And then the sun rose at midnight. That's the only way I can describe it. A second sun, impossibly bright, exploded into existence at the base of the steel tower. It was white, pure white, so bright that I could see it through my closed eyelids, through my hands pressed against my face, through the rock I was hiding behind. The light expanded, a sphere of incandescent plasma growing and rising, impossibly beautiful and impossibly terrible. It was like looking into the heart of creation itself, into the primordial fire from which the universe was born. Colors rippled across its surface, purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. The entire spectrum cycling through the fireball faster than the eye could follow. For those first few seconds, there was no sound, just the light, pure and terrible, expanding outward at thousands of feet per second. The steel tower didn't collapse or melt. It simply vanished, vaporized instantly, turned into ionized gas by temperatures that rivaled the core of the sun. And then the sound hit me. It wasn't just a noise. It was a physical thing, a wall of compressed air that slammed into my body and knocked the breath from my lungs. A roar that seemed to come from the center of the earth, from the heart of a star, from the throat of God himself. It wasn't one sound, but 1,000 sounds layered on top of each other. Thunder and avalanche and earthquake all combined into something that no human ear had ever heard before. The sound went on and on, echoing off the mountains in the distance, reverberating through the desert. A sustained note of apocalypse that seemed like it would never end. It rolled over me in waves, each one hitting with physical force, rattling my bones, shaking my organs, making my teeth vibrate in my skull. And then the shockwave followed, a wall of wind that tore at my clothes and filled the air with sand and debris. I clung to the rock, feeling the ground shake beneath me, feeling the world tremble at what we had done. The wind was hot, not just warm, but genuinely hot, carrying heat from the fireball, heat that made me think of ovens and furnaces and the fires of hell. When I finally opened my eyes and dared to look, the fireball had risen high into the air and was beginning to form into the shape that would define the rest of the century. A column of fire rising into the sky, thousands of feet high, roiling and churning with its own internal weather. And at the top, a cap of cloud spreading outward, forming the distinctive mushroom shape that would become the symbol of the atomic age. I stood up slowly, my legs weak, my ears ringing from the blast. The mushroom cloud continued to rise, climbing higher and higher into the morning sky. 10,000 feet, 20,000, 30,000. 40,000. It towered over the desert like a monument to human achievement and human hubris, glowing with its own light, purple and orange and green, colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The steel tower was gone, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The sand around Ground Zero had been transformed into glass, a green, glassy substance that would later be called Trinity, named after the test site. The heat had been so intense that it had melted the sand and fused it into glass in an instant. We had split the atom. We had unlocked the power of the sun. We had become gods, or demons. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the mushroom cloud rise and spread across the sky. Minutes. Hours. Time had lost its meaning. All I could do was stare at what we had created, at the terrible beauty of it, at the proof that human beings had finally gained the power to destroy themselves on a massive scale. Eventually, I heard vehicles approaching, jeeps full of soldiers and scientists racing across the desert toward the test site. They were shouting, some of them laughing, celebrating. We'd done it. The gadget had worked. The test was a success. I slipped away before they could see me, moving through the confusion and chaos, making my way back toward the observation bunkers. I had to find Oppenheimer. I had to see his face, to understand what he was feeling in this moment of triumph and horror. I found him standing outside the control bunker, surrounded by scientists and military officers who were all talking at once, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. But Oppenheimer stood apart from them, silent, his face ashen, his eyes distant. He looked like a man who had just stared into the abyss and realized that the abyss was staring back. I pushed through the crowd until I was standing next to him. "Dr. Oppenheimer," I said quietly. He turned to look at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even fear. It was grief. Pure, bottomless grief. "We've done it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've created the most terrible weapon in human history, and nothing will ever be the same again." General Groves pushed through the crowd, grinning like a proud father. He was a large man, built like a bulldozer, his face red with excitement. "Congratulations, Oppie, you did it. By God, you actually did it. That was bigger than anyone predicted. At least 18,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Maybe more. We're still calculating the exact yield, but it's clear this is going to change everything. We're going to end this war, and we're going to do it in a way that makes sure no one ever dares to challenge us again." But Oppenheimer didn't respond to the congratulations. He just stood there, staring at the mushroom cloud that was slowly dissipating in the morning sky, spreading out into a thin layer of radioactive debris that would drift for hundreds of miles. "It worked," he said, almost to himself. "God help us all, it worked." Groves slapped him on the back, still grinning. "Stop being so gloomy, Oppie. This is a great day. You've given America the most powerful weapon in the world. You should be proud." Oppenheimer turned to look at Groves, and I saw something flicker across his face. Anger? Contempt? It was gone before I could identify it. "Yes," he said flatly. "I'm very proud." Groves didn't catch the sarcasm. He was too busy congratulating the other scientists, shaking hands, talking about how this would change the war in the Pacific, how it would save American lives, how it would demonstrate American technological superiority. But Kenneth Bainbridge, the director of the Trinity test, approached Oppenheimer with a different expression. He looked exhausted, drained, as if witnessing the test had taken something fundamental out of him. "Now we're all sons of bitches," he said quietly to Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we are." Over the next few hours, as the sun rose properly and the reality of what we'd accomplished began to sink in, I watched the Manhattan Project scientists grapple with what they'd done. Some were jubilant, celebrating the success of their calculations, the vindication of years of work. They'd solved the hardest scientific problem in human history, and they'd done it in less than 3 years. It was an achievement that would have been unthinkable before the war. Others were subdued, thoughtful, already beginning to understand the implications of what they'd created. I saw physicists standing alone, staring at the dissipating mushroom cloud, their faces troubled. I heard conversations that stopped abruptly when military personnel approached. Scientists clearly discussing the morality of what they'd done but not wanting to be overheard. And Oppenheimer seemed to age years in the span of hours. He moved through the crowds of scientists and military personnel like a ghost, accepting congratulations mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. I watched him for most of the morning, and I never once saw him smile. I found him again in the late afternoon, sitting alone in his office, staring at nothing. The blinds were drawn, blocking out the desert sun. The office was dim and cool, but it felt like a tomb. "Dr. Oppenheimer," I said from the doorway, "are you all right?" He looked up at me and I saw that he'd been crying. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears that he'd made no effort to hide. "I keep thinking about the people who are going to die," he said, his voice rough. "The Japanese civilians who will be burned alive when we drop this on their cities. The people who will die slowly from radiation sickness, their bodies rotting from the inside out. The children who will never be born, or who will be born with terrible deformities. And I keep thinking that I'm responsible for all of it, that I'm the one who made this possible." "You didn't do this alone," I said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind me. Thousands of people worked on this project, hundreds of scientists, tens of thousands of workers and engineers. This was a collective effort, but I led it. Oppenheimer said, his voice rising slightly. "I organized it. I recruited the scientists. I solved the technical problems that made it work. I convinced people to come to this godforsaken desert and work on something they only half understood. Without me, without my leadership, this might not have happened. Or it might have happened too late to use in the war. And now because of me, we have this weapon. This terrible, beautiful, horrible weapon that will kill hundreds of thousands of people." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and I noticed that the ashtray on his desk was overflowing with butts. He'd been chain smoking for hours. "Do you know what I saw when the bomb went off? In that first instant, when the light was so bright it burned through my closed eyelids, I saw something. A vision, maybe. Or maybe just my conscience finally forcing me to face what I'd done. I saw cities burning. I saw people turn to ash in an instant. I saw children dying from radiation poisoning, their hair falling out, their skin covered in lesions. I saw the future we've created, and it's a nightmare." I sat down across from him, not sure what to say. What comfort could I offer to a man who had just ushered in the atomic age? What words could possibly address the magnitude of what had happened? "You said before that someone had to do it," I reminded him. "That if you didn't, someone else would. Someone with fewer scruples." "I know what I said," Oppenheimer replied bitterly. "I was trying to justify it to myself, trying to convince myself that I'd made the right choice. But now, seeing what we've created, watching that mushroom cloud rise into the sky, I'm not so sure. Maybe it would have been better if no one had done it. Maybe humanity isn't ready for this kind of power. Maybe we'll never be ready for it." He stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. His hands were trembling so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the lighter to work. "The worst part is that I can't even claim ignorance. I knew what we were building. I understood exactly what it would do. And I did it anyway. I pushed forward, solved every problem, overcame every obstacle because I was convinced that it was necessary, that the ends justified the means. And now?" I asked. "Now I'm not so sure the ends ever justify these means," he said quietly. "How many deaths would be acceptable to prevent? 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? At what point does the calculus of death become so monstrous that the cure is worse than the disease? And who gets to make that decision? Who has the right to play God with millions of lives?" There was a knock at the door and a young physicist stuck his head in. It was Philip Morrison, the man who'd fetched me that morning for the implosion team meeting. "Dr. Oppenheimer, General Groves wants to start the debriefing session. He wants to go over the data from the test and discuss the timeline for deploying the weapons against Japan." Oppenheimer's face went even paler, if that was possible. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. Morrison nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Oppenheimer sat there for a moment, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. "They want to use it as soon as possible," he said. "Groves has already been in contact with Washington. President Truman is at the Potsdam Conference right now, negotiating with Stalin and Churchill about the post-war order. And now we've given him the ultimate bargaining chip. The power to destroy cities with a single bomb. The power to reshape the world according to American interests. He stood up slowly, like an old man, though he was only 41 years old. I should go. The generals want their weapon. The politicians want their victory. And I'm the one who has to deliver it to them. I'm the one who has to explain how to use this terrible thing I've created. What will you tell them? I asked. Oppenheimer looked at me with those haunted blue eyes. I'll tell them the truth. That we've created a weapon of unprecedented power. That it will work as designed. That it will kill tens of thousands of people in an instant and condemn tens of thousands more to a slow death from radiation poisoning. And then I'll watch as they decide how and when to use it. Because that's my job now. Not to question the morality of it, but to provide the technical expertise needed to deploy it effectively. He walked to the door, then paused and turned back to me. Thank you for listening, Dr. Wilson. It helps to talk to someone who seems to understand the weight of what we've done. Most of the others are either celebrating or in denial. But you seem to grasp the magnitude of it. After he left, I sat alone in his office for a long time. The sun was setting outside, painting the New Mexico desert in shades of gold and red. The same desert where, just hours before, we'd detonated a device with the power of 20,000 tons of TNT. The same desert where the sand had been fused into radioactive glass. The same desert that would forever bear the scars of what we'd done. I thought about my mission, about the Chrononaut directive to observe without interfering, about the responsibility of bearing witness to history's darkest moments. And I thought about whether that was enough, whether it was moral to stand aside and watch tragedy unfold when you had the power to prevent it. But what could I do? The knowledge existed. The bombs had been built. In 3 weeks, Little Boy would be loaded onto the Enola Gay and flown to Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Fat Man would destroy Nagasaki. And nothing I did could change that. These were fixed points in history, moments that had to happen for the timeline to remain stable. Or so I'd been told. I left the office and wandered through Los Alamos as night fell. The base was quieter now, the initial excitement of the successful test giving way to exhaustion and reflection. I saw scientists walking alone, lost in thought. I heard conversations through open windows, people discussing what they'd witnessed, trying to process it. In the mess hall, I found a group of younger physicists celebrating. They'd brought out some bootleg whiskey. Alcohol was technically prohibited on base, but everyone knew it was available if you knew where to look. And they were toasting their success. "To the gadget," one of them said, raising his glass. "The most complicated physics experiment in human history, and it worked perfectly. To Oppenheimer," another added, "the man who made it all possible." They drank, laughing and joking, reveling in their achievement. I understood their excitement. They were young, most of them in their 20s or early 30s, and they'd just accomplished something that would secure their place in history. They'd solved problems that had seemed impossible, answered questions that had never been asked before. From a purely scientific perspective, it was magnificent. But I couldn't share their celebration. I kept seeing Oppenheimer's face, the grief in his eyes, the tears on his cheeks. I kept thinking about the people who would die in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the mothers and fathers, the sons and daughters, the grandparents and grandchildren. Real people with real lives who would be snuffed out in an instant because of what we'd created here. I left the mess hall and walked out into the desert night. The stars were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. The same stars that had looked down on humanity for millions of years, indifferent to our struggles and achievements. I found a rock and sat down, staring up at the stars. Somewhere up there, in the vastness of space, there might be other civilizations, other species that had discovered atomic energy. I wondered if they'd managed to harness it without destroying themselves, if they'd found a way to use this power for good rather than evil, or maybe they'd all made the same mistake we were making. Maybe every civilization that discovered atomic energy inevitably weaponized it. Maybe that was the filter, the great filter, that explained why the universe seemed so empty of intelligent life. Not because intelligence was rare, but because intelligent species tended to destroy themselves once they gained the power to do so. Can't sleep either? I turned and saw Enrico Fermi approaching. The Italian physicist looked tired but alert, his eyes bright with the kind of manic energy that comes from going too long without sleep. "No," I said. "Too much to think about." Fermi sat down next to me. "I keep running the numbers in my head. The yield, the blast radius, the thermal effects, the radiation dispersal. It's fascinating from a purely scientific standpoint. We created temperatures and pressures that have never existed on Earth before. We replicated for a brief moment the conditions at the heart of the sun. It's extraordinary. It's also terrifying," I said. "Yes," Fermi agreed. "It's that too. But terror and wonder aren't mutually exclusive. The universe is full of things that are both beautiful and terrible. Supernovae, black holes, the birth of stars, and now atomic explosions." He paused. "I've been thinking about what this means for the future. We've proven that it's possible to release atomic energy in an uncontrolled explosion. But the same principles could be used to create controlled reactions, power plants that could generate electricity without burning coal or oil, ships that could sail for years without refueling, maybe even spacecraft that could reach the stars." "That's the optimistic view," I said. "Someone has to be optimistic," Fermi said with a slight smile. "Otherwise, what's the point? Yes, we've created a weapon of terrible, destructive power, but we've also demonstrated that atomic energy is real, that it's practical, that it can be harnessed. What we do with that knowledge, whether we use it to destroy or to create, that's up to us." We sat in silence for a while watching the stars. Finally, Fermi spoke again. "You know what's interesting? Before the test, some of us were taking bets on the yield. I started a betting pool. I guessed 10,000 tons of TNT equivalent. Teller guessed 45,000. Beth guessed 8,000. Oppenheimer was cautious, guessing only 300 tons. "Who won?" I asked. "Nobody, really. The actual yield looks like it's around 20,000 tons, give or take. More than Oppenheimer expected, less than Teller hoped for. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is that we were taking bets on something that could have killed us all. We were betting on the yield of an explosion that, if our calculations were wrong, might have ignited the atmosphere and extinguished all life on Earth. What kind of people do that? Physicists?" I suggested. Fermi laughed. "Yes, physicists. People who are so fascinated by the fundamental nature of reality that they're willing to bet on apocalypse. I'm not sure if that makes us brilliant or insane. Probably both." He stood up and stretched. "I should try to get some sleep. Tomorrow, or rather later today, there will be meetings, analyses, reports to write. The work never stops." He paused. "Try to get some rest, Dr. Wilson. History has already been made. What comes next, we'll deal with when it arrives." After he left, I continued to sit there watching the stars. I thought about all the physicists I'd met over the past few days. Oppenheimer, tortured by guilt. Fermi, pragmatic and focused on the science. Teller, enthusiastic about the technical challenges. Kistiakovsky, proud of his implosion design. Bainbridge, sobered by what he'd witnessed. All of them brilliant, all of them dedicated, and all of them, in their own way, struggling with what they'd done. I stayed there until the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Monday morning, 24 hours after the Trinity test. The atomic age was 1 day old. I made my way back to my dormitory as the base began to wake up. Scientists were emerging from their quarters, bleary-eyed and exhausted, heading to the mess hall for coffee. I joined them, sitting at a corner table with a cup of bitter black coffee and a plate of eggs that I couldn't taste. The conversations around me were subdued. The celebrations of the previous night had given way to reflection and, in some cases, regret. I heard physicists discussing the moral implications of what they'd done, whether the bomb should be used against Japan, whether there were alternatives that didn't involve killing civilians, whether they should speak out against the use of the weapon they'd created. But I also heard military officers discussing deployment strategies, the best targets in Japan, the optimal altitude for detonation, the weather patterns over the home islands. They were already planning how to use the bombs, treating it as just another weapon, another tool in the arsenal of war. Over the next 2 days, I watched as Los Alamos began to return to something approaching normal. The initial shock of the successful test wore off, replaced by the routine work of analyzing data, writing reports, and planning for the future. The Manhattan Project wasn't over. There were still 2 bombs to prepare for use against Japan, and already there were discussions about building more. I attended meetings where scientists presented their analyses of the Trinity test. The exact yield was calculated at 22 kilotons, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. The fireball had reached a diameter of over half a mile. The heat had been intense enough to melt sand into glass for a radius of several hundred yards. The shockwave had been felt over 100 miles away. Windows had broken in Silver City, 120 miles from ground zero, and the radiation. That was the part that troubled many of the scientists. The radioactive fallout had drifted for miles, contaminating the landscape, settling on farms and ranches. People who lived downwind of the test site had been exposed to radiation without their knowledge or consent. Some of them would develop cancers years later, never knowing that their illnesses stemmed from a test conducted in July 1945. I also watched Oppenheimer continue to struggle with what he'd done. He threw himself into work, attending every meeting, reviewing every report, making decisions about the deployment of the bombs against Japan. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. He smoked constantly, barely ate, slept only a few hours a night. He looked like a man being consumed from the inside out. On my last evening in Los Alamos, I found him once again sitting outside his office, staring up at the stars. It had become his habit, I'd learned. Late at night, when everyone else had gone to sleep, he would sit there and smoke, lost in thought. "Dr. Wilson," he said as I approached. "Come to say goodbye?" "Yes," I said, sitting down next to him. "I'm heading back to California tomorrow, back to Berkeley." It was a lie, of course. Tomorrow I would activate my chrono device and jump back to the present. But Oppenheimer didn't need to know that. "I envy you," he said quietly. "You get to leave this place. Go back to your normal life. Forget about what happened here." "I'll never forget," I said honestly. "How could I? I witnessed something that changed the world forever." Oppenheimer nodded slowly. Yes you did. And now you get to live with that memory just like the rest of us." He lit another cigarette. "Do you know what I've been thinking about? I've been thinking about consequences, about how every choice we make ripples outward, affecting things we can't predict or control. The butterfly effect," I said. "Exactly. A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and a month later there's a tornado in Texas. Small actions leading to large consequences." He took a drag on his cigarette. "I made a choice 3 years ago to lead this project. It seemed like the right choice at the time. We were at war. Hitler was building his own atomic bomb, or so we thought. We had to get there first. It was a matter of national survival. But now," I prompted, "now I'm not so sure. The Germans weren't anywhere close to building a bomb. We know that now. They'd made fundamental errors in their calculations. Even if the war had continued, they probably wouldn't have succeeded. So we built this weapon to counter a threat that didn't exist." He laughed bitterly. "And now we have it. This terrible power. And we're going to use it against Japan, not because we need to, but because we can. Because it's there. Because we spent $2 billion building it and we need to justify that expense." "You think the war could be won without using the atomic bombs?" I asked. Oppenheimer turned to look at me. "Honestly, yes. I think Japan is already defeated. Their navy is destroyed. Their cities are being firebombed into rubble. The Soviets are about to invade Manchuria. They're surrounded, cut off, running out of resources. If we just maintain the blockade, if we just wait a few more months, they'll have to surrender. But we're not going to wait. We're going to drop these bombs, kill hundreds of thousands of people, because it's faster, because it sends a message to the Soviets, because it demonstrates American power." He stubbed out his cigarette with unusual violence. "And I'm complicit in all of it. I can't claim innocence. I can't say I didn't know what would happen. I built this weapon knowing exactly what it would do, and now I have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life." "What will you do?" I asked. "After the war is over, after the bombs are used, what will you do?" "I don't know," Oppenheimer said. "Part of me wants to walk away. to go back to Berkeley, to teach, to do pure research, to pretend this never happened. But I can't do that. I have a responsibility. I helped create this power, and now I have to help control it. I need to work toward international control of atomic weapons. I need to speak out against the development of even more destructive weapons. I need to try to put the genie back in the bottle, even though I know it's probably impossible. He stood up and stretched. It's late. We should both get some sleep. You have a long trip ahead of you tomorrow. I stood as well. Dr. Oppenheimer, I want you to know something. What you've done here, it wasn't evil. You were trying to end a war, to save lives, to protect your country. The fact that you're struggling with the morality of it, the fact that you're questioning your choices, that's what separates you from the monsters. That's what makes you human. Oppenheimer looked at me for a long moment, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. Thank you for that, Dr. Wilson. I hope you're right. I hope that doubt and guilt are enough to redeem what I've done, but I'm not sure they are. He shook my hand, and I felt the tremor in his fingers, the physical manifestation of the emotional burden he carried. Safe travels, Dr. Wilson. And remember, the choices we make matter. Every single one of them. Make yours wisely. I watched him walk back into the administrative building, his shoulders bowed, his steps slow and heavy. A brilliant man crushed by the weight of his own creation. A genius who had reached too far and touched the face of God, only to recoil in horror at what he'd done. The next morning, I left Los Alamos for the last time. I walked out into the desert, far from the buildings and the guards, to a place where I could be alone. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful. The desert was always beautiful, in its stark and unforgiving way. I activated the chrono device on my wrist. The display lit up, showing coordinates and temporal vectors. I set the destination for home, for the present day, for headquarters. But before I jumped, I took one last look at Los Alamos, at this place where humanity had discovered the power to destroy itself, at the temporary buildings and the guard towers and the scientists who had worked here, giving their genius and their conscience to create the most destructive device in human history. And I thought about Oppenheimer's final words to me. The choices we make matter, every single one of them. In 3 weeks, at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay would drop Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb would detonate at an altitude of about 2,000 feet, directly over the city center. The fireball would reach temperatures of several million degrees, hot enough to vaporize everything within a half-mile radius. The blast wave would flatten buildings for miles. The fires would rage for days. Between 70 and 80,000 people would die instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed, their bodies ravaged by radiation poisoning. 3 days later, at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, a B-29 named Boxcar would drop Fat Man on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 people would die instantly. Another city would be transformed into a wasteland of rubble and ash and lingering radiation. And 6 days after that, on August 15th, Japan would surrender. The war would be over, and the atomic age would truly begin. In the years that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union would build tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, bombs thousands of times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan, missiles that could fly halfway around the world in 30 minutes, submarines carrying enough destructive power to obliterate entire nations. The world would live under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation for decades, always aware that one mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of madness could end everything. But we would survive. Somehow, despite everything, humanity would survive. Treaties would be signed, arms would be reduced. The Cold War would end not in fire but in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while the weapons would still exist, while the threat would never entirely go away, we would prove that Oppenheimer's faith in humanity was not entirely misplaced. We would prove that we were capable of restraint, that we could possess the power to destroy ourselves without actually using it, that we could look into the abyss and step back, at least so far. I pressed the activation button on the chrono device, and reality folded around me. The desert disappeared, replaced by the white light of temporal transit. I felt myself pulled apart and reassembled, stretched across time and space. a consciousness without form hurtling through the void between moments. And then I was home. I materialized in the arrival bay at headquarters, my legs weak, my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. The technicians rushed forward to check my vitals, to verify that I'd made the jump successfully, to debrief me on what I'd seen. But I barely heard them. All I could think about was Oppenheimer's face, the grief in his eyes, the weight he carried. All I could think about was the mushroom cloud rising into the sky, beautiful and terrible, a symbol of humanity's greatest triumph and greatest sin. "Nicola?" one of the techs asked, concerned. Her name was Sarah, and I'd known her for years. She was young, brilliant, dedicated. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I said quietly. "I've seen several of them. The ghosts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ghosts of all the people who died because of what was created at Los Alamos." She looked at me with sympathy. "It was a hard mission then." "They're all hard," I said. "But this one was different. This one showed me what happens when brilliant people convince themselves that the ends justify the means. When they build something terrible in the name of a greater good, and then have to live with the consequences of what they've created." I spent the next week writing my report, documenting everything I'd seen and heard, trying to capture the emotional and psychological state of the Manhattan Project scientists in those final days before and after the Trinity test. But words seemed inadequate. How do you describe the look in Oppenheimer's eyes? How do you convey the weight of standing near ground zero and watching the world change? How do you explain the complexity of men who were simultaneously heroes and villains, geniuses and fools? The senior chrononauts read my report with great interest. They asked questions, probed for details, wanted to know more about Oppenheimer's state of mind, about the moral debates that had raged among the scientists, about the atmosphere at Los Alamos in those crucial days. "You did good work," the director told me. "This report provides valuable insights into one of history's most important moments. The psychological impact of creating the atomic bomb, the moral struggles of the scientists involved. This is information we couldn't get from the history books. This is the human dimension of history." "Thank you, sir," I said. But I didn't feel proud. I just felt tired and haunted by what I'd witnessed. "Take some time off," the director said, noticing my expression. "You've earned it. Process what you saw. Come to terms with it. And when you're ready, we'll have another assignment for you." I took that time off, spending weeks walking through parks, reading books, trying to find some peace. But the images stayed with me. The mushroom cloud rising into the sky, Oppenheimer's tear-stained face, the steel tower vanishing in an instant, the terrible beauty of that first atomic explosion. And I kept thinking about the choices we make, about how every decision, every action, every word can ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control, about how the line between hero and villain is often thinner than we'd like to believe. Oppenheimer had made his choice. He'd led the Manhattan Project, solved the technical problems, overseen the Trinity test. And then he'd spent the rest of his life questioning that choice, advocating for nuclear arms control, speaking out against the hydrogen bomb, trying to put limits on the power he'd helped unleash. Were his choices right? I still don't know. I'm not sure anyone can judge that, but I know they were his choices made with full knowledge of their weight, and that he accepted responsibility for them even when that responsibility became unbearable. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Make our choices, accept their consequences, try to do better next time. The atomic age didn't end civilization. We survived. We muddled through. We built institutions and treaties and systems of deterrence that, so far at least, have prevented the use of nuclear weapons in war since 1945. We proved that Oppenheimer's faith in humanity, however fragile and uncertain, was not entirely misplaced. But the shadow of the mushroom cloud remains. We live in a world where the weapons still exist, where the knowledge can never be forgotten, where the possibility of our own extinction is always just one bad decision away. We live in the world that Oppenheimer and his colleagues created that terrible morning in July 1945. And sometimes late at night I think about him. I wonder about the rest of his life after Los Alamos, after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki. I know from history that his life after the war was difficult. I know that he became an advocate for international control of atomic energy, that he opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, that his left-wing political associations from the 1930s came back to haunt him. I know that in 1954, his security clearance was revoked in a humiliating public hearing, essentially ending his government career. I know that he died in 1967 of throat cancer, likely caused by the decades of chain smoking I'd witnessed at Los Alamos. A broken man, some said, a man haunted by what he'd done. But I also know that he never stopped trying, never stopped advocating for peace, for arms control, for a better future. He carried the weight of his choices until the end, neither running from them nor wallowing in them, but accepting them as the price of the power he'd wielded. And in that at least there's something heroic, something worth remembering, because Oppenheimer understood something that many people never grasp, that power without responsibility is tyranny, and that those who wield great power must also bear great burdens. He understood that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions, no choices without consequences. He understood that sometimes you have to make terrible decisions in terrible circumstances, and then live with the weight of those decisions for the rest of your life. I think about the last words he spoke to me. The choices we make matter, every single one of them. Make yours wisely. Those words have stayed with me through all my subsequent missions, all my travels through time. They've informed every decision I've made, every action I've taken, because Oppenheimer was right. The choices we make do matter. They ripple outward through history, affecting people and events we'll never know about, shaping the future in ways we can't predict. And while we can't always make the right choices, sometimes there are no right choices, only less terrible ones, we can at least make our choices consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of their potential consequences. We can take responsibility for what we do, even when what we do is painful or difficult or morally ambiguous. That's what Oppenheimer did. He made his choice, and then he owned it. He didn't hide from the consequences. He didn't pretend he was blameless. He looked at what he'd done, acknowledged the horror of it, and then spent the rest of his life trying to mitigate the damage. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. The dead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki couldn't be brought back. The nuclear arms race couldn't be prevented. The atomic age, with all its terrors and dangers, had begun and couldn't be ended. But Oppenheimer tried. And maybe that's all we can ask of anyone, that they try, that they struggle with the moral implications of their actions, that they question themselves, doubt themselves, agonize over whether they've done the right thing, because the truly dangerous people aren't the ones who struggle with their choices. They're the ones who never question what they're doing, who never doubt, who are absolutely certain of their righteousness. Those are the people who can commit atrocities without guilt, who can destroy without remorse, who can wield power without responsibility. Oppenheimer wasn't one of those people. He was a man who agonized over every decision, who tortured himself with doubt, who carried the weight of his choices like a physical burden. And while that didn't absolve him of responsibility for what he'd done, it did make him human, flawed, struggling, painfully aware of his own capacity for both greatness and terrible error. I carry that lesson with me now, in all my travels through time, in all the historical moments I witness, in all the people I meet and the events I observe. I try to remember that history isn't made by heroes and villains, but by human beings. Complex, contradictory, capable of both nobility and monstrosity. People trying to do what they think is right, making the best choices they can with the information they have, and then living with the consequences. Sometimes those consequences are glorious, sometimes they're tragic, and sometimes, as in Oppenheimer's case, they're both. The mushroom cloud rose over the New Mexico desert that July morning in 1945, beautiful and terrible, marking the moment when humanity finally gained the power to destroy itself completely. And standing at the center of it all was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist who had reached into the heart of the atom and pulled out something that would change the world forever. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Those words, spoken by the god Vishnu in the Bhagavad Gita, became Oppenheimer's epitaph, his legacy. The phrase that would forever be associated with his name and his work. But I think there's more to his legacy than that. I think his legacy is also the example he set of how to grapple with the consequences of one's actions, how to carry the weight of difficult choices, how to question oneself without being paralyzed by doubt, how to try to make amends for the harm one has caused, even when those amends can never be sufficient. That's the lesson I took from Los Alamos. That's what I learned from watching Oppenheimer struggle with the weight of what he'd created. Not that we should never take bold actions or make difficult choices, but that we should always be aware of the consequences of those choices. That we should always question ourselves, always doubt, always struggle with the moral implications of what we're doing. Because the day we stop questioning ourselves is the day we become monsters. I am Nicola Brown, a traveler through time and history. If you enjoyed this adventure of mine, subscribe to the channel and share it.